Mario Plata was a name whispered by the dusty wind of Mexico City's forgotten streets, but before he became a dark legend, he was just a man. At 45, his existence was defined by the relentless routine of a sanitation worker, a ghost in an orange jumpsuit who moved through the early mornings, cleaning the vestiges of a city that barely noticed his presence. His life was a cycle of sweat and fatigue, an anonymous effort to maintain a minimum of dignity in a world that seemed built to crush him. Stories like Mario's, of invisible men who carry the weight of the world, deserve to be told. If you believe these voices need to be heard, help us build a strong community that will not be silent. Our goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers so that accounts like this can reach more people. Comment where you're watching from and join us on this journey, showing that no one is forgotten. His body, though aged by manual labor, still held the strength of someone who refuses to yield. Every street, every alley, every lane forgotten by the daylight was a map engraved in his memory. He knew the secrets the metropolis hid under the cloak of night, the meeting points of traffickers, the escape routes of thieves, the places where bodies were dumped and hope went to die. This knowledge, acquired in the indifference of his trade, was his only valuable possession, though he did not yet know it. To Mario, the streets were not just his workplace. They were a living organism, pulsating with danger and corruption, a sleeping monster he had learned to navigate without ever awakening its fury. He was a silent master of a geography that the police and official cartographers completely ignored. Mario's true wealth, however, was not in the streets, but within the fragile walls of his small apartment. There, he ceased to be the invisible sanitation worker and transformed into a father and husband. His wife, Sophia, was the sun that warmed his weary soul, a woman whose resilience turned scarcity into an abundance of affection. And there was little Luna, his 10-year-old daughter, a beacon of innocence and joy amidst the city's darkness. Her laughter was the only music that mattered, her dreams the only ambition he nurtured. For them, he faced the world every day, dreaming of a modest future where Luna could get an education and escape the fate that seemed sealed for those born in their neighborhood. This was his holy trinity, the altar upon which he laid all his hopes. The family dynamic was a refuge of tenderness in a brutal daily life. The nights were filled with the smell of beans cooking slowly, with the stories Sophia told about her village, and with Luna's homework, which Mario helped with infinite patience, even as his body ached with exhaustion. He would watch his daughter draw colorful worlds on cheap sheets of paper and see in her the promise of a life he never had. It was in these moments that Mario felt like a king in his exposed brick castle, a complete man whose happiness was as real and palpable as the hot asphalt under his feet during the day. This peace, however, was as fragile as a pane of glass in a shootout, a calm before the most violent of storms. The presence of the La Serpiente cartel was a constant shadow, a disease that seeped into every crevice of the community. Everyone knew of its existence, of its cruelty, but survival demanded a pact of silence. Mario had taught Luna to lower her eyes, to ask no questions, to walk the streets as if she were deaf and blind to the violence that surrounded her. He himself followed this rule to the letter, becoming a master in the art of seeing, hearing, and speaking no evil. He believed that if he kept his family inside a bubble of normality, the evil that plagued the neighborhood would never touch them. He clung to this illusion with the same force he used to grip the handle of his broom, sweeping away the visible dirt while ignoring the invisible rot that had already contaminated everything. His job gave him a unique perspective on the city's decay. He cleaned the trash of the rich and the poor, saw the remnants of luxurious parties and the detritus of extreme misery. In the dumpsters of the cartel boss's condominiums, he found imported champagne bottles and expensive product packaging, a brutal contrast to the hunger he saw in the eyes of the children on his own street. This disparity fueled a silent anger, a deep understanding of the injustice that ruled the world. He was not a revolutionary, not even a man who questioned the order of things. He was just an observer, a mute chronicler of hypocrisy and cruelty, accumulating within himself a dangerous knowledge about the geography of corruption and power. Mario's routine was his shield. Waking before the sun, kissing the foreheads of his sleeping wife and daughter, drinking his bitter coffee, and heading out into the still, dark streets. The sound of the garbage truck was the soundtrack of his life, the sweet smell of decomposition, his daily perfume. He found a strange peace in this repetition, a sense of purpose in his task of cleaning, of bringing a minimal order to the chaos. It was honest work, which allowed him to bring bread home and look his family in the eyes without shame. He asked for nothing more from the world, the right to be a simple man, to work in peace and to love his family, a modest request that would soon prove impossible to grant. On that fateful night, the air seemed heavier, laden with a premonition that an exhausted Mario could not decipher. He returned home a little later than usual, carrying a small candy for Luna, a promise he had made that morning. As he turned the corner of his street, an unnatural silence greeted him. There were no children playing, no sound from the neighbors' televisions. There was only a deathly stillness, a sense of vacuum that chilled his blood. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs, a terrible premonition forming in his mind. The door to his apartment, his sanctuary, was ajar, a macabre invitation to the end of his world, the prologue to a story that would be written in blood and vengeance. What Mario found inside his home was no longer a sanctuary, but a desecrated altar. The silence that had greeted him on the street now screamed inside the apartment, a high-pitched ringing in his ears. The furniture was overturned, a blind violence imprinted on every broken object, but it was the stillness of the bodies that annihilated his soul. Sophia, his beloved Sophia, lay on the living room floor, an angel with broken wings, and in the small bedroom, amidst colorful drawings scattered on the floor, was Luna. Her fragile body seemed even smaller in death. The candy Mario had brought, a small chocolate, slipped from his trembling hand and rolled across the floor, stopping next to a red-colored pencil. Mario's world did not just crumble. It was pulverized, turned into a dust of memories and pain that suffocated him, and in that instant, the man he was died along with his family. The night unfolded into a feverish nightmare, a succession of disconnected images that would be seared into his mind forever. The rotating lights of the patrol cars painted the walls of his apartment with flashes of red and blue, desecrating the happy memories that lived there. Policemen came and went, their dirty boots treading on the sacred ground of his pain, their voices an indifferent murmur. Mario sat in a corner, wrapped in the blanket a paramedic had given him, but the cold came from within, an ice spreading through his veins. He watched the bodies of his wife and daughter being covered and carried away, and a part of him went with them. He did not cry. Tears seemed like a luxury, a human reaction to a pain that had stripped him of all his humanity, leaving only an empty shell. The next day, an automaton moved by a final vestige of blind hope, Mario went to the police station. The place reeked of cheap disinfectant and stagnant despair, a bureaucratic purgatory where justice was just another form to be filled out. He waited for hours on a hard wooden bench until he was finally called into Captain Morales's office. The captain was a portly man with a cynical gaze and a mustache that seemed to permanently hide a sneer. He leafed through the preliminary report with an offensive boredom, treating Mario's tragedy as just another number in the city's bloody statistics. To Morales, Mario's pain was an inconvenience, an interruption in his routine of complicity and corruption, and he made no effort to hide his contempt. The humiliation was the final nail in the coffin of his grief. Captain Morales suggested, with veiled cruelty, that the incident was likely a score settling gone wrong, implying that perhaps Mario had some connection to the crime. "These things happen. "Your family was in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, with the coldness of someone discarding trash. Every word was a stab, stripping Mario of the dignity of his own pain. He was treated not as a victim seeking justice, but as a nuisance, an insignificant piece in the dirty game Morales played with the La Serpiente cartel. The police would not investigate. No one would be arrested. The message was crystal clear. The lives of his wife and daughter were worthless to the system. They were just two more anonymous deaths in the city of the forgotten. As he left the station and stepped back into the sunlight, which now seemed offensive in its brightness, something inside Mario irrevocably changed. The overwhelming pain did not subside, but it began to merge with a cold, cutting rage. He looked at his own hands, calloused from years of honest work, and for the first time saw them as tools. The system had not just abandoned him, it had spit in his face. In that moment, standing on the dirty sidewalk, grief gave way to purpose. Justice would not be given. It had to be taken. Mario Plata, the sanitation worker, decided that if the city was full of trash, he would do the cleaning. This was his decision, his call to action, a silent vow to hunt down and exterminate every single person responsible. The first few weeks after the burial were a blur of silence and dust. Mario moved through his empty apartment like a ghost, the echo of his daughter's laughter and his wife's voice haunting every room. But grief, in its purest form, is a luxury, and his was being consumed by a cold flame growing in his chest. He did not sleep. He watched. During the day, he continued his sanitation route, but his eyes no longer saw the trash on the sidewalks. He scanned faces, memorized license plates, listened to the careless conversations of low-level criminals who felt invisible. His city, once a labyrinth of labor, had now become his personal hunting ground, and he waited patiently, learning the routines of his future prey with the diligence of a predator. The first target was a man named Hector, one of the cartel's minor hitmen, whose involvement in the massacre had been confirmed by a drunken conversation Mario overheard behind a bar. Following him was easy. Hector was careless, arrogant in his small share of power. Mario watched him for 3 nights, mapping his habits, his gambling addiction, and the route he always took through a dark alley to cut his way home. Using his knowledge of collection routes, Mario positioned a dumpster to create a bottleneck in the alley, a perfect blind spot. He waited in the darkness, his heart beating a frantic, irregular rhythm, clutching a heavy piece of iron pipe. There was no strategy, only the visceral certainty of what needed to be done. The confrontation was anything but cinematic. It was dirty, desperate, and brutally intimate. When Hector entered the alley, Mario struck him from behind. The blow was not fatal. Hector, bigger and stronger, turned, his face a mask of surprise and fury. The ensuing fight was a grotesque dance of stumbles and clumsy blows. Mario was not a trained fighter. He was driven by a rage that gave him an unnatural strength. They rolled on the filthy ground amidst torn garbage bags. Mario felt Hector's fists on his face, but the physical pain was a distant noise. He finally managed to immobilize the man, and with the iron pipe delivered the final blows, each accompanied by a dry sob that escaped his throat. When it was over, the silence of the alley was deafening, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the sound of him vomiting on the ground. The smell of blood and garbage mixed, creating a nauseating perfume of revenge. He looked at what he had done, at Hector's lifeless body, and felt no triumph. There was no relief, no peace that he had imagined. There was only a deeper emptiness, a black hole in his soul that the other's death could not fill. Trembling, he took a small silver saint's medal from his pocket, an object that had belonged to Sophia, and left it on the dead man's chest. It was his first signature. The first act of Mario Plata, the Vigilante, was a baptism of blood and disillusionment. The next day, the newspapers barely mentioned the incident, classifying it as just another gang-related murder, a footnote in the city's daily chronicle of violence. The death of an anonymous hitman mattered to no one, just as the deaths of Mario's family had not mattered. Stories like these are lost every day in the noise of an indifferent world. That is why your support is so crucial. By subscribing to this channel, you help us ensure that these voices are not silenced, that the complexity behind the violence is explored. Every subscription is a vote of confidence, a statement that we refuse to look away. Join us so we can continue to bring the stories hidden in the shadows to light. That first brutal act, however, brought about a fundamental change in Mario. Hesitation and horror gave way to a cold efficiency. He understood that emotion was a luxury that could cost him his life. He embraced his sanitation worker disguise not just as camouflage, but as an identity. Who would suspect the man who swept the streets, who emptied the dumpsters, who was so much a part of the urban landscape as to be invisible? He moved through the city with a freedom that no cop or criminal possessed. The night was his domain, the garbage truck his Trojan horse, and the knowledge of every alley and sewer his arsenal. The hunt continued, and Mario became bolder, more precise, a phantom, leaving a trail of bodies and small silver pieces. The second and third targets fell with frightening speed. One was ambushed during the trash collection at a luxury restaurant frequented by cartel members. The other was found in a drainage canal that Mario knew like the back of his hand. With each death, he became more detached, the act of killing turning into a mechanical process, a necessary cleansing. The Plata signature began to generate whispers in the underworld. It was no longer random. Of violence, it was a deliberate hunt. The legend of the Vigilante was born there in the forgotten alleys, a rumor that spread like wildfire, sowing fear in the hearts of those who once thought themselves untouchable. The anonymous sanitation worker was becoming the city's most feared monster. It was then that Elena, a young and ambitious investigative journalist for a second-rate newspaper, began to connect the dots. While the police officially treated the cases as gang warfare, she noticed the pattern. The victims were all from La Serpiente, and at each crime scene, a small silver object was found. She saw what others did not. This was not chaos. It was a message. Intrigued by the killer's audacity and precision, she began her own investigation, christening the mysterious figure El Limpiador, the cleaner, a name that captured the public's imagination and would soon be on everyone's lips, turning the anonymous vigilante into a media phenomenon. Mario's growing notoriety attracted a different kind of attention. Javier, a young mechanic whose older brother had been executed by the cartel for refusing to pay for protection, recognized the pain in the sanitation worker's eyes. He saw Mario pass by every day, a silent, broken figure, and felt a connection. One night he approached Mario in his alley, not with accusations but with an offer. "If you need a car fixed, no questions asked, or a place to lie low, I can help," he said. Javier did not want to partake in the violence, but he saw the vigilante as the only possible form of retribution. He became Mario's first and only ally, a silent facilitator in his solitary war. Meanwhile, in the poor neighborhoods, the figure of the vigilante transformed into a folk saint, an avenging angel for the oppressed. The people, fed up with the cartel's violence and the police's neglect, began to idolize him. Small altars with candles were erected at the murder sites. Street musicians composed corridos, ballads that narrated the deeds of the mysterious cleaner who hunted the serpents. They did not know his face or his name, but they knew his work. To the elite and the police, he was a bloodthirsty monster threatening the order. But to the dispossessed, he was the embodiment of a divine and brutal justice, the only justice they would ever know in their lives. The only person who saw the terrifying truth behind the legend was Father Francisco, the old priest who had baptized Luna and comforted Mario at the funeral. Saw the light go out in the man's eyes. He sought him out one dawn, finding him near his old home, staring at the dark windows. "Son, What you are doing is not justice. It is an echo of the same violence that destroyed your life. You are becoming them, the priest pleaded, his voice heavy with genuine pain. He tried to reach the man who still existed beneath the Avenger's mask, reminding him of his faith, of his humanity, offering him a way out through forgiveness and redemption. Mario heard the priest's words, but they were in a language he no longer spoke. "There is no soul left to save, Father," he replied, his voice hoarse and emotionless. "They burned it along with my family. Now, only ashes and the mission remain. Pray for them, Father, because I will not stop until every one of them has paid." The appeal from his last connection to his old life was rejected. Mario turned his back on the priest and on the possibility of salvation, plunging headfirst into the darkness he had chosen for himself. His journey was no longer about finding peace. It was about spreading war, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. News of the systematic hunt finally reached the ears of those who mattered within La Serpiente's structure. Operations were being disrupted, men were terrified, and the cartel's reputation was being challenged by a single man. The order came from the top. The ghost, calling himself Plata, needed to be found and made an example of. The task was assigned to the most feared and sadistic lieutenant in the organization, a man whose nickname was whispered with dread: El Carnicero, the Butcher. He was known for his brutality and his pleasure in dismembering his enemies, a true psychopath in the cartel's service. The hunt had become mutual. El Carnicero was the antithesis of Mario. Whereas Mario had been forced into violence, El Carnicero reveled in it. He saw cruelty not as a means, but as an end in itself. He was a large man, with a scarred face and eyes that gleamed with a malignant intelligence. He did not underestimate his adversary. He saw in the Vigilante's methods a discipline and a rage that intrigued him. For him, hunting this new enemy was not a job. It was a sport, an exciting challenge. He mobilized his informants, deployed his men, and began to tighten the noose, eager for the confrontation with the man who had dared to challenge his reign of terror. At the same time, Captain Morales was feeling the pressure from all directions. The media, fueled by Elena's articles, was turning the Vigilante into a celebrity. His superiors demanded results, and his partners in the cartel were furious at his inability to control the situation. The Vigilante was not just a threat to the law, but a direct danger to his corrupt arrangement. If the Vigilante were caught alive, he could expose the entire rotten police force. Therefore, Morales's order to his men was clear: find him and eliminate him. There would be no arrest, no trial. The Vigilante needed to disappear permanently. The city transformed into a three-front battlefield. One night, following a lead, Mario fell into an ambush set by Morales's task force. Cornered in an industrial yard, he seemed to have no way out. Bullets ricocheted off the metal walls around him, but while the cops thought like cops, Mario thought like trash. He saw a sewer grate, an entrance to the subterranean labyrinth that only he knew. Under a hail of gunfire, he pried open the grate and disappeared into the fetid darkness of the city's sewer system, leaving behind a team of frustrated cops and an even more enraged captain. The escape reaffirmed his advantage. He was a rat in a maze of his own making. The hunt grew more desperate. Mario was now the most wanted man in the city, hunted by the cartel that wanted his head and the police who wanted his silence. He lived in the shadows, sleeping in garbage depots, eating what he could find, constantly moving. His appearance had become feral, his face thin, his eyes sunken and blazing with a feverish intensity. He had become a creature of the night, an urban spectre. The man who once dreamed of a simple life was now the epicenter of a violent war, a pawn who refused to be sacrificed, and who was instead determined to topple the king. Elena's investigation took her deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. She bribed a clerk at the station and obtained a copy of the original murder report for the Plata family, a document that had been buried. Reading the details and the way the case was summarily closed by Morales, she understood everything. The Vigilante's origin was not that of a psychopath, but of a man who had everything stolen from him by a complicit system. Her perspective shifted radically. He was not just a killer, he was a symptom of a much deeper disease corroding the city. She decided the story she needed to tell was not about the monster, but about what created him. With the net closing in, Mario knew he had to accelerate his hunt, to aim higher in the hierarchy. His next target was one of El Carnicero's right-hand men, a man named Alvarez, known for his ostentation. After weeks of surveillance, Mario tracked him to his fortified home in an upper-middle-class neighborhood. He spent days studying the security, the routines, looking for a weakness. The opportunity arose during a party Alvarez was hosting. Using his sanitation worker uniform and a stolen garbage truck, Mario gained access to the property's perimeter, hiding among the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As he waited, hidden in a bush, he looked through a large glass window. Loud music and laughter floated through the air, and then he saw him. Alvarez was not with his henchmen, but in the living room, away from the party. He was kneeling on the floor, laughing, as his young son, about 5 years old, ran towards him and jumped into his arms. The man who ordered massacres, who trafficked drugs and destroyed lives, was there, just being a father, kissing his son's face with a love that seemed genuine. The scene hit Mario like a punch to the gut, a cruel mirror of everything he had lost. For a long, torturous moment, Mario hesitated. The image of Luna at 10 years old, laughing in the same way, flooded his mind. The weapon in his hand felt like it weighed a ton. He was about to do to that child exactly what had been done to him: steal his father, destroy his world, plant a seed of hatred that could blossom into another monster. Vengeance, which until then had seemed so pure and just, suddenly revealed itself in all its ugly, cyclical complexity. He was becoming the creator of the same pain that consumed him. The line separating him from his enemies became almost invisible, and he found himself staring into the abyss of his own monstrosity. How does a man justify his actions when he becomes a mirror image of the evil he swore to destroy? That is a question that haunts not only characters like Mario, but all of us in moments of anger and pain. It's a dilemma that forces us to look inward. We created this space to explore these difficult questions, to go beyond black and white. If you value this search for understanding, I ask you to subscribe. Your subscription allows us to continue this conversation, to delve into these complex narratives, and to try, together as a community, to comprehend the fragile nature of our own humanity. Help us continue to tell the stories that matter. Mario's hesitation was shattered by a terrible detail. On the wrist of Alvarez's wife, who joined the family scene, he saw a delicate bracelet with a small moon charm. It was Sophia's bracelet, the one he had given her on their last anniversary. The sight shattered his moral paralysis. This was no longer about a cycle of violence. It was about the desecration of her memory. The doubt evaporated, replaced by a cutting ice. He was not like them. He was an instrument of retribution. He waited for the woman and child to leave the room, and then he acted. The murder was swift, silent, and devoid of any emotion. It was not an act of rage, but an execution. He had crossed the final threshold. Before he died, Alvarez, in a desperate act to save his own life, revealed crucial information. He detailed the nerve center of El Carnicero's operations, the place where he felt safest, where he took his enemies to torture them. It was an old, abandoned slaughterhouse in the city's industrial zone, a place of death and decay that served as the sadistic lieutenant's unholy throne. With his last words, Alvarez gave Mario the map to the heart of darkness, the exact location of his chief tormentor. The information was the key Mario needed to end his journey. With the name of the slaughterhouse echoing in his mind, a final, absolute purpose took hold of Mario. The end was near. There were no more secondary targets, no more distractions. All his pain, all his rage, all his journey had led him to this point. The decision to go to the slaughterhouse was instantaneous and irrevocable. This would be the final confrontation, the conclusion of his bloody opera. He had no illusions. It was a suicide mission, a willing dive into the mouth of hell. But death no longer scared him. He prepared his makeshift weapons, put on his sanitation worker uniform one last time, and headed for the slaughterhouse. A man walking knowingly toward his destiny, ready to kill or be killed. The abandoned slaughterhouse was a monument to death. The smell of old blood, rust and rot was so thick you could chew it. Mario moved through the shadows of the place, a labyrinth of cracked tile corridors and processing rooms where meat hooks hung from the ceiling like skeletal metal fingers. Every puddle of stagnant water reflected his face, that of a stranger, hardened and consumed. The silence was profound, a stillness that seemed to absorb all sound, awaiting the spilling of more blood to consecrate its unholy ground. This was not just his enemy's lair, it was a physical representation of Mario's soul, a place where life had been methodically dismembered and innocence slaughtered. He felt at home in that hell of concrete and steel. He found him in the main killing chamber. El Carnicero did not seem surprised, but rather like a host awaiting his guest of honor. He was calmly sharpening a butcher's cleaver, the sound of scraping metal echoing through the vast space. A cruel smile spread across his face when he saw Mario. "I was wondering when the garbage man would come to collect the trash," he sneered. And then, with sadistic precision, he began to describe the last moments of Sophia and Luna, not as a report, but as a performance, savoring every detail of his wife's pleading and his daughter's crying. He wanted to break Mario, to turn him from a cold hunter into an animal blinded by rage, because animals are easy to slaughter. The instant Mario lunged, a roar of engines and the sound of tires screeching on gravel engulfed the slaughterhouse. The filthy windows were flooded with blinding lights, and the metal doors were kicked open. Figures in black, armed with assault rifles, stormed the facility. It was Captain Morales's task force. "Leave no witnesses! Kill them all!" the captain yelled, his voice muffled by the first volley of gunfire. The two-man confrontation turned into a three-way pandemonium. The cartel's men, caught by surprise, returned. Fire, and the slaughterhouse became a cauldron of bullets, screams, and chaos. Mario, everyone's target, dove behind the metal carcass of an old grinder, his personal revenge now relegated to a desperate fight for survival. A stray bullet tore through his shoulder, a sharp pain that brought him back to reality. Warm blood ran down his arm, but the pain focused him. He was not a soldier, nor a gangster. He was a sanitation worker. He knew chaos, disorder, and how to move through it. As Morales's men and the cartel's men killed each other in a disorganized firefight, Mario slipped through the shadows, using the slaughterhouse's labyrinthine architecture to his advantage. He toppled a rusty metal shelf, creating a distraction in one area, while he moved to flank a shooter in another. He became a ghost in the killing machine, turning Morales's trap into his own tactical playground, an unseen conductor orchestrating a symphony of mutual destruction. Bleeding and weakened, he knew he could not last forever. The only way out was through El Carnicero. He lured him into the heart of the facility, to a rusty conveyor belt that led to an old bone crusher. With a monumental effort, he found the control panel and reactivated the decrepit machinery. The belt began to move with a protesting screech, the hooks swinging erratically. The final fight between the two men took place in that hellish, industrial setting, a deadly dance amidst gears and chains. El Carnicero was stronger, but Mario was smarter, using every piece of the environment as a weapon. The scenery of death now his greatest advantage. In a desperate move, Mario used the iron pipe he still carried to jam El Carnicero's leg in the conveyor belt's chain. The large man fell, his face contorting in genuine panic for the first time. He was dragged slowly toward the crusher. He screamed, he begged, but Mario just watched him, his face impassive. He felt no pleasure, no anger, no satisfaction. He just watched the process, the final cleaning. He looked into his enemy's eyes as the machine pulled him into its metal embrace, and in the last second he saw not a monster, but just a terrified man. And when the sound of mechanical death ceased, the silence that followed was the emptiest of all. With El Carnicero's end, most of the cartel men were dead or fleeing. Morales' cops moved in, cornering a gravely wounded Mario. He found himself face to face with the captain, who pointed his pistol at his head, triumph on his corrupt face. "It's the end of the line, garbage man," Morales said. Mario, leaning against a wall, covered in blood and grime, just gave a faint, bloody smile. With his free hand, he pulled an emergency lever on a refrigerant gas tank, releasing a jet of ammonia that filled the room with a toxic fog. As the cops coughed and retreated, blinded and choking, Mario dragged himself to a service exit and disappeared into the night, a spectre leaving hell behind for the devil who created it to clean up. Gravely wounded, Mario Plata moved like a dying animal through the forgotten veins of the city. He crawled through sewers and vacant lots, each breath a blade in his chest. The adrenaline that had sustained him drained away, leaving behind excruciating pain and an exhaustion that weighed more than the world. He found refuge in an abandoned garbage depot, a place that smelled of decay and endings. There, in the darkness, he tended to his wounds with dirty rags and an iron will, the last vestige of his old resilience. The hunt was over. The fire that had consumed him had burned out, leaving only a desert of ashes in his soul. He was no longer an avenger, not even a man. He was just what was left, an echo fading into the shadows he had chosen as his only home. The official version of what happened at the slaughterhouse was a masterpiece of corrupt fiction. Captain Morales, posing for the cameras with a solemn expression, described the scene as the result of a brutal internal war within the La Serpiente cartel. The infamous Vigilante, he claimed, was likely one of those involved, killed in the confrontation and conveniently incinerated in a chemical fire. Morales was hailed as a hero who dismantled a dangerous criminal cell. The systemic rot remained untouched, stronger than ever. Within a few months, a new leader, even more ruthless than the last, took control of La Serpiente. The machinery of violence and corruption simply replaced a worn-out part with a new one, continuing to turn in the same relentless way. However, the truth found a crack to breathe through. Elena published her story, not in a major newspaper, but on an independent blog that quickly went viral. Without hard evidence to bring down Morales, she told the human story, that of a sanitation worker named Mario Plata, of his murdered family, and of the indifference of a system that turned him into a monster. Her article did not absolve him of his crimes, but it contextualized them, presenting the Vigilante not as an anomaly, but as a logical and tragic consequence of the city's moral bankruptcy. She gave a name to the phantom and a reason for his fury, forcing the citizens to confront the uncomfortable truth that in their society, justice sometimes had to wear a hideous mask. Mario Plata, the man, was never seen again. He dissolved into urban mythology, becoming a ghost story whispered on cold nights. To some, he was a demon, a merciless killer, to the oppressed of the forgotten. Neighborhoods, he remained a dark saint, a ghostly protector. Children were frightened by his name, and criminals looked over their shoulders, fearing the ghost of the sanitation worker. Mario's victory was absolute, and at the same time, a complete defeat. He got his revenge, cleansing the world of the men who destroyed his family. But the price was his own humanity. He found no peace, no redemption, only the deafening silence of a fulfilled purpose, which left him with nothing but an infinite void. Mario Plata's journey ends here, not with a resolution, but with a question that echoes in the darkness. What is the true cost of vengeance when it costs us our very soul? His story is a grim reminder that the line between man and monster is terrifyingly thin, and that often the broken systems that create such figures are the only things that survive intact. We are immensely grateful that you have accompanied us to the end of this visceral account. It is your support, shown in every subscription, that gives us the strength to continue telling the stories that need to be heard, the voices that are silenced by indifference. If you believe that memory and truth matter, join our community. Your presence ensures that we are not alone in this quest.